Wes, the mayor will see you now. As I began walking toward the mayor's mahogany door, I instinctively stuck my hands in my pockets and pushed down, trying to get the cuffs of my pants lower so my high waters might brush the tops of my shoes. For close to a decade, I dressed in a uniform every day. Fashion was not my forte. This was my best blue suit, but because I had owned it since high school, it was no longer much of a fit. Hey General, how is everything going? Mayor Schmoke said as I cautiously entered and shook his hand. General was his nickname for me, poking fun at the fact that I was a brand new second lieutenant in the Army Reserve, which, by the way, is as far from a general as an officer can get. Despite my being on my second internship with him and seeing him every day, the mayor still intimidated me. Every time I stepped into his office, I felt the need to genuflect. Even his famously toothy grin failed to put me at ease. Kurt Schmoke had been the mayor of Baltimore for 12 years. The former boy wonder was now a seasoned and slightly cynical leader of the city he'd called home his entire life. Progress had been made under his leadership. Baltimore had been named an empowerment zone by President Clinton in 1994. On his orders, and with the help of 375 pounds of explosives, the buildings of Murphy Homes were brought down in 20 seconds and soon replaced with mixed income housing. But his frustration at the glacial pace of change in his city had worn on him. He needed to attend fundraiser after fundraiser just to remain a viable candidate for public office. The problems he'd warned of and prioritized over a decade earlier were persistently difficult to solve. The murder rate had not fallen under 300 years and had not fallen under 300 in years. Sexually transmitted diseases throughout Baltimore had risen sharply alongside the teen pregnancy rate. The young, photogenic Yale, Oxford, and Harvard educated lawyer had learned just how confounding the problems of urban America were. Of course, to talk about the negative sections and aspects of Baltimore without talking about its strengths, its history, and its opportunities would be inaccurate. Baltimore is the birthplace of Babe Ruth and Thurgood Marshall, Edgar Allan Poe, and Billie Holiday. The Battle of Baltimore was one of the deciding battles of the War of 1812, and Francis Scott Key, a lawyer and native Baltimorean, penned the Star-Spangled Banner at Fort McHenry while watching soldiers from our new nation fight off the British. Baltimore is home of the B&O Railroad and the best crab cakes anywhere. West Baltimore was one of the intellectual capitals of the East Coast in the early 20th century. At the same time, to simply walk along the pristine inner harbor or go see the Orioles in action without understanding that all of Baltimore is not downtown would be equally misleading. The truth is that there are two Baltimores. Almost every other major city in this country leads the same double life. Those who brag about Baltimore often ignore these substandard areas. Yet there were the areas Mayor Schmoke knew would determine his legacy of success or failure. He asked me to take a seat on a couch. I found his office imposing when I first saw it, but its quiet elegance had over time made stronger impression. Plaques and awards lined the walls, along with photos of the mayor with presidents, prime ministers, and everyday Baltimoreans. The office reflected the man, hugely impressive and unassuming at once. His waistline had grown slightly over the years. His suspenders now pulled his pants above his belt line. In the final year of his third term and preparing to retire, he was leaving not because of term limits, but because of fatigue. He could have easily won a fourth term had he wanted it, but he didn't. What he wanted now was time to spend with his family and for someone else to grab hold of the reins of the city he loved with its daunting array of problems. Mary Schmoke eased into a chair across from the couch. He leaned back, rubbing both hands over his thinning hair, now salted with gray, and asked me how had enjoyed my internship. I offered a crisp response. I loved it, sir. But my glib answer didn't do justice to the impact the time in his office had had on me. I didn't know how to begin to express my gratitude. I'd returned to Baltimore 2 years earlier after I'd been accepted at Johns Hopkins University to complete my undergraduate degree, which I'd begun in junior college at Valley Forge. One afternoon at Valley Forge, I was talking to my college advisor about what to do after I received my associate's degree. My advisor told me that she knew the assistant director of admissions at Johns Hopkins, who she wanted me to meet. My mother had been working in Baltimore for the past 5 years, and I considered Baltimore home, so I knew about Johns Hopkins. I just didn't know anyone who went there. My perception of Hopkins was as a distant force in the neighborhood. a research university responsible for some of the greatest medical gifts the world has ever received. But that had very little to do with life of the city I knew. Hopkins was also full of kids who did not look or sound like me. Ma'am, I do not want to be a doctor, I quickly answered her. Wes, it's much more than that. Just have lunch with him. At the very least, I think you'll enjoy each other's company. A week later, I sat across the table from Paul White, the assistant director of admissions at Johns Hopkins. I was expecting a stodgy, older gentleman who'd offer me canned encomiums about Hopkins and then stiffen and ask for the check when he found out the details of my standardized test scores. What I found was a black man with a warm disposition and a booming voice, who bristled with energy and was constantly in motion, his hands swooping like birds in flight to accentuate his points. I spent much of the lunch telling him my story, and he spent the remaining time selling me on Hopkins. By the end of our meal, I realized that Hopkins represented much more than a chance to attend a great school with a phenomenal reputation. It was also a chance to go home. My relationship with my mother had changed significantly. I'd spent so much of my life running from her, trying to show her that I didn't need her as much as she thought. She had spent much of the same period being an unrelenting disciplinarian. But as I got older, and as she realized her days of hardcore parenting were coming to an end, she became more than a mother. She became a friend. But there was still the matter of getting in. My SAT scores were hundreds of points below the average for students entering Johns Hopkins, and despite my being a junior college graduate and an Army officer, I knew that landing admission at Hopkins would be a stretch at best. So after filling out the application, I put it out of my mind. But months later, I got the large package in the mail. Not only was I accepted, but I would receive scholarship money. I read the letter aloud to my mother over the phone, and she screamed in excitement. While reading the letter, I thought about Paul White. Having an advocate on the inside, someone who had gotten to know me and understood my story on a personal level, had obviously helped. It made me think deeply about the way privilege and preference work in the world, and how many kids who didn't have luck like mine in this instance would find themselves forever outside the ring of power and prestige. So many opportunities in this country are apportioned in this arbitrary and miserly way, distributed to those who already have the benefit of a privileged legacy. Many of the kids I grew up with in the Bronx, including guys like Shay, who stayed outside the law, never believed that they'd had a shot. Many in the generation before mine believed that maybe they did, but they had the rug pulled out from under them by cuts in programs like the Pell Grants or by the myriad setbacks that came with age of crack. Reversal spun them right back to the streets and away from their true ambitions. For the rest of us, those who snuck in despite coming from the margins, the mission had to be pull up others behind us. And that's what Paul White did for me, and it changed my life. I'd been talking with Mayor Schmoke for 10 minutes when he leaned towards me and asked the dreaded question. So, Wes, what do you plan on doing after you finish school? I really had no idea. The words law school escaped from my mouth, the fallback answer for many students who have no idea what they want to do with their lives. Mayor Schmoke waved his hand at the idea. Have you ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship? I had heard of it. I knew that Mayor Schmoke, President Clinton, and our state's senior senator, Paul Sarbanes, were all Rhodes Scholars, but I didn't know much else about the award. Let me show you something, the mayor continued, rising from his wooden seat and moving toward the wall. I followed him. He pulled out a pen and stretched his arm toward a black and white framed picture. Right there is James Atlas, the writer from The New Yorker. Over here, that's Frank Raines. He's the head of the Office of Management and Budget in the Clinton administration. His pen then moved a few inches over on the picture, and there I am. This is my Rhodes class. I stared at the photo of 80 young faces smiling into the camera. The plaid suits with large collars, the bushy mustaches and overdue haircuts, and the thick knotted ties were all obviously stylish back when he went to Oxford, but looked a little funny through contemporary eyes. Then again, my high waters and medium-sized suit jacket didn't exactly qualify me as a fashion critic. I recognized a few other faces in the crowd and realized that, whether they were household names or not, this was an exclusive group that held a significant amount of influence and power. People who could engineer real change. Mayor Schmoke continued to tell me about his experience as I listened intently.